The exam hall was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional click of a pen. It was the day of the most important exam in the galaxy, a test where students from different planets and species came together to compete for the highest honors. Among the hundreds of students sat one human, quietly preparing for the challenge ahead. They were known across the galaxy for their incredible memory, and everyone around them couldn't help but wonder how the human would perform. At the front of the room, the alien proctor stood tall. He was a member of the Zilith species, a race with 4 long arms and eyes that glowed in the dark. His voice echoed through the hall as he announced the beginning of the exam. "This is a test of knowledge, focus, and endurance," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You will have 2 hours to complete the exam. Use your time wisely." The students around the human fidgeted nervously, some cracking their knuckles, others whispering to their friends. But the human sat still, eyes focused on the front of the room. The air felt thick with pressure, yet the human remained calm. It was as if they had done this 1,000 times before. In the row next to the human sat a young alien student named Threx. Threx was from a species known for their intelligence, but not their memory. Threx had studied hard for this exam, but still felt unsure. The other students seemed so confident, especially the human. Threx had heard the rumors. Humans had a memory like no other. They could remember entire books just by reading them once. It was a power Threx couldn't even imagine. As the exam began, Threx glanced over at the human. Their eyes were locked on the exam paper, but Threx could see the small smile that played at the edges of their lips. It was a smile of someone who knew they were ready, someone who had no doubt about their ability to succeed. Threx felt a pang of jealousy, but quickly pushed it aside. There was no time to waste. The exam had started, and they had to focus. The first question appeared on the screen in front of every student. It was a complex problem about intergalactic physics. Most of the students started scribbling notes immediately, but the human didn't even look at their paper for a moment. Instead, they closed their eyes for just a second, as if to gather their thoughts. When they opened their eyes, they picked up their pen and began writing. Each answer flowed smoothly, without hesitation. Threx's eyes widened. They couldn't believe it. The human hadn't written anything down from their notes. They were just writing the answers from memory. Threx's heart raced. How is that possible? Threx thought. How can they remember all of that so easily? Threx glanced down at their own paper. The first question was already confusing them, and they hadn't even started on the second one. As much as they tried to focus, the answers just wouldn't come. They quickly looked to the human again. The human had already moved on to the second question, their pen moving smoothly across the paper. Threx could feel a growing sense of panic. "I can't fall behind," Threx thought, feeling the pressure building. The alien student's eyes darted back and forth, trying to find a way to make things easier. It was then that Threx noticed something. The human was sitting with their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the paper, but they weren't scribbling fast. They were writing slowly, carefully, as if they were taking their time. There was no rush in their movements. A sneaky thought crept into Threx's mind. If I can just copy a few answers, I can catch up. Threx had heard about the human's great memory, but this wasn't about respecting it. It was about winning. Threx decided to sit a little closer, just enough to catch a glimpse of the human's paper. They leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the human's hand as it moved across the paper. But the human didn't notice. They were still completely absorbed in their work. Threx leaned in even more, trying to get a better look. The human's pen never stopped moving. It was almost as if the answers were already in the human's head, just waiting to be written down. Threx's eyes narrowed. How are they doing this? Threx thought. Frustrated, the alien student's fingers twitched as they fought the urge to reach out and copy the answers, but they knew it wouldn't work. They had seen the human's answers before. They weren't written in the usual way. The human didn't write down a single formula or complex equation. They simply wrote the answers as if they had already learned everything by heart. Threx took a deep breath, trying to steady their racing mind. The human was winning this battle without even trying. Threx felt a sudden wave of doubt. Maybe I've been focusing on the wrong things all along, Threx thought. Maybe the key to this exam isn't just knowledge, it's something else. As Threx sat there, still trying to keep up, they couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. This wasn't just a test of knowledge. It was a test of something much more powerful. Threx couldn't believe what was happening. As the minutes ticked by, the human continued to write answer after answer, never pausing, never second-guessing themselves. It was like the information was flowing straight from their mind onto the paper without effort. Threx, on the other hand, was struggling with every question. The more they looked at the human's perfect answers, the more frustrated they became. Threx had always been known for their sharp intellect, but memory was never their strong point. Their species could think quickly and solve complex problems, but retaining information was another story. They had studied for weeks, poring over books and data, yet it felt like nothing would stick. The human was doing what Threx had dreamed of, using their memory effortlessly, recalling everything with precision. Sitting at their desk, Threx fidgeted. Sweat started to form on their brow as the tension built. There was no way they would be able to finish this exam on time if they kept going at this pace. And then, like a spark, a thought hit Threx. I don't have to do this on my own. I can just copy off the human. The idea seemed perfect. The human's memory was flawless. Surely their answers were the key to success. Threx could sit close enough to the human and sneak a peek at the paper. They'd get the answers they needed and finish the exam with ease. Threx grinned to themselves. They'd figured it out. This was the way to win. With their plan in mind, Threx adjusted their posture. They stretched out their back, pretending to shift in their seat. They casually glanced around the room, making sure no one was watching. Everyone else was too busy with their own work to notice. But Threx couldn't take any chances. If they were going to pull this off, they had to be smart. Threx shifted their chair slightly to the side, so they were now seated closer to the human. The human didn't seem to notice, absorbed in their work. Threx leaned in just enough to see the edge of the human's paper. The answers were written clearly, each one perfect. It was as if the human had already memorized every detail. The temptation to copy was overwhelming. Threx's eyes darted between their own paper and the human's, trying to catch a glimpse of the answers. But the human's hand moved so quickly that it was hard to follow. Every time Threx thought they had a good look, the human would shift their hand or turn the paper just enough to make it impossible to read. It was maddening. Still, Threx was determined. They would not be outsmarted by a human. Their eyes narrowed, and they made a mental note to move closer. They needed to get this right. Threx casually adjusted their chair, making small, subtle movements so they could inch closer to the human without drawing attention. With each shift, Threx found themselves sitting just a bit closer until they were practically shoulder to shoulder. The human seemed completely unaware of Threx's growing presence. They were still writing with steady confidence, as though they were the only ones in the room. Threx couldn't help but stare. The human didn't use any notes or tools, nothing but their own memory and focus. It was as if the human had tapped into some kind of secret power. Threx's hand trembled slightly as they tried to hold their paper steady. They couldn't let the human know they were copying. That would ruin everything. But with each passing second, it became harder to resist. Threx's mind raced with thoughts of what they could do if they had those perfect answers. They could finish the exam quickly, then relax. Maybe even become a top student, just like the human. Finally, Threx saw an opening. The human had paused for just a moment, looking at the ceiling as if deep in thought. It was the perfect opportunity. Threx glanced down at the paper, quickly copying a few answers. They didn't even need to understand what they were writing. They just needed to get the answers down. The plan was working. Threx's heart raced with excitement as they jotted down what they had copied. They glanced up at the human again, but the human hadn't noticed a thing. Threx felt a wave of relief. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could stop them. But just as quickly as the feeling came, it was gone. Frex looked back at their own paper and realized something. This wasn't right. They had just copied the answers without truly understanding them. Would they be able to remember any of it once the exam was over? The alien student's confidence began to waver. For a second, doubt crept into Threx's mind. Was it really worth it to cheat? What if the answers didn't make sense, and the human knew something Threx didn't? Frex looked at the human again. They had never once hesitated, never once glanced around for help. The human wasn't relying on anyone but themselves. Frex's plan had worked for now. But deep inside, the alien student knew something was missing. They were cheating, but they weren't truly learning. They weren't using their own mind to solve the problems. They were just copying, and that didn't feel like winning at all. Threx sat back in their chair, feeling both nervous and guilty. They had copied a few answers from the human, but something about it didn't sit right. Every time Threx glanced over at the human, they could see that the human wasn't struggling. They weren't rushing. They weren't looking at anyone else for help. It was as if the answers were coming to them from thin air. Threx stared in awe, unable to understand how the human could be so calm while everyone else was frantically working. The alien student shifted in their seat, their mind racing. What's their secret? Threx thought, trying to focus on their own paper again. The human had already moved on to the next section of the exam. Every answer the human wrote down was flawless, precise. Threx tried to copy more, but each time they looked over, the human seemed one step ahead. Threx paused for a moment. Something felt off. The human wasn't using notes, no gadgets, no hidden tricks. It was just their brain. Threx couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Why does the human seem so different? Threx wondered. As the exam dragged on, Threx couldn't stop looking at the human. There was no panic in their face, no sign of stress. They moved through the questions with a quiet confidence that made Threx question everything they thought they knew about studying. How was this possible? It was as if the human had mastered the entire exam without ever looking at a book. Threx's curiosity grew. They glanced down at their own answers, feeling the weight of the cheating. The answers they had copied didn't make sense to them. It was all just a jumble of words and formulas they hadn't really understood. But the human? The human's answers were clear, logical, and perfect. Threx realized that they had missed the point of the test entirely. It wasn't about copying the answers. It was about truly understanding them. But how had the human done it? Threx couldn't help but watch the human again. The human paused for just a second, looking up at the ceiling as if in deep thought. Then, without looking at their notes, the human wrote down the next answer with perfect clarity. Threx couldn't believe it. They're not looking at anything, Threx whispered to themselves. How do they remember all of this? That was when it hit Threx. The human wasn't using their notes because they didn't need them. The secret was their memory. The human's memory wasn't like anyone else's. It was something else entirely. Threx had heard stories about humans before. They were always described as having extraordinary memories. But Threx had never understood what that meant until now. The human's secret weapon was simple, yet powerful. Their ability to remember everything. Threx looked back down at their own paper, feeling a sense of defeat. How could I ever compete with that? Threx thought. The alien student had been so focused on finding a way to cheat, they hadn't realized that the true power was in the human's mind. All those hours of studying, all the books they had read, they didn't hold a candle to the human's natural ability to memorize and recall information. For the first time in the exam, Threx felt truly helpless. The answers weren't in a book, or a note, or a gadget. They were in the human's brain, stored away like a vault, ready to be unlocked whenever needed. Threx had been relying on shortcuts, hoping to get by with cheating, but it was clear now that the human had something far more valuable than that. Real knowledge, stored in their mind, ready to be used at any moment. Threx couldn't help but wonder how the human had developed such an amazing memory. Were they born with it, or had they worked hard to build it over time? Either way, it was clear that this was something that couldn't be copied. Threx couldn't just steal the human's answers. They couldn't even begin to understand how the human's mind worked. Feeling a mix of awe and frustration, Threx leaned back in their chair. The human's secret weapon wasn't a trick. It wasn't technology or some clever cheat. It was their mind, and Threx realized they had underestimated it. This wasn't just a memory. It was a level of focus and understanding that Threx could never replicate by simply copying answers. As the exam continued, Threx's mind began to shift. No longer were they focused on cheating or shortcuts. They started to wonder if they could learn something from the human. Maybe, just maybe, if they could improve their own memory, they could unlock the same kind of power. The human wasn't relying on gadgets, and neither would Threx. It was time to stop looking for easy ways out and start focusing on the real challenge, learning and understanding. But for now, Threx could only watch as the human continued to fill out the exam paper, each answer a testament to their incredible memory. Threx couldn't deny it anymore. The human's secret weapon was not something that could be copied. It was something that had to be earned through dedication, focus, and an unshakable belief in the power of their own mind. The ticking of the clock grew louder in Threx's ears as they glanced anxiously at their paper. Time was running out. The exam was nearly halfway through, and Threx had only answered a few questions. Their mind felt like it was spinning, and the pressure was mounting. They had seen the human's perfect answers, and it only reminded them of how far behind they were. Threx's gaze shifted toward the human again. The human's pen never stopped. They were focused, writing quickly and without hesitation. It was as if the answers were already imprinted in their mind. Threx's stomach tightened with a feeling they hadn't expected. Fear. They had relied too much on cheating, on copying the human's work. But now, even that wasn't enough. The answers they had copied felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. They couldn't understand them. Worse, they couldn't remember the formulas or the steps to solve the problems. The pressure was eating away at them. Desperation started to creep into Threx's thoughts. What can I do? They thought, their fingers tapping nervously on the desk. They had never been in this situation before. Threx had always been quick on their feet, always able to outsmart the competition. But today, it felt like nothing they did was working. Threx glanced at the human again. This time, the human was finishing the next section of the exam, their hand moving swiftly over the paper. Threx's eyes narrowed in frustration. How are they doing this? Threx wondered. I studied for weeks. They didn't even look at a single book. And still, they're ahead. They're always ahead. Threx's mind began to race. They knew they couldn't keep copying forever. If they got caught, it would be over. Threx wasn't sure how much longer they could keep pretending that they were solving the problems on their own. The answer to the test wasn't in copying. It was in understanding. But Threx couldn't understand. Not like the human. The human's brain seemed to work in a way that Threx could never match. Threx's desperation grew. They needed a way out. They needed to finish this exam, even if it meant doing something extreme. They couldn't fail. Not after all the work they had put in. Not after all the expectations they had to live up to. Without realizing it, Threx shifted closer to the human's desk again. Their eyes darted to the human's paper. Maybe, just maybe, they could copy just a few more answers. They had already copied some, so what difference would it make? Threx tried to ignore the growing feeling of guilt gnawing at them. They had made it this far, so why not go all the way? But then, as Threx reached for the human's paper, they noticed something. The human wasn't writing from notes or from memory alone. It was more than that. The answers were coming to them, as if they were seeing the entire problem solved in their mind. Every equation, every word, seemed to flow into place without effort. It wasn't just the human's memory. It was something else. Threx couldn't understand it, but they knew they were missing something important. In that moment, something inside Threx snapped. The fear of failing took over completely. They couldn't let this slip through their fingers. They needed those answers. And they needed them now. Threx quickly jotted down some notes from the human's paper, hoping it would be enough to fill in the gaps. Their hands shook with anxiety as they wrote down what they could. They didn't care if they understood it. All that mattered was finishing. But even as Threx scribbled, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were losing something much more valuable than just a passing grade. They weren't solving the problems. They weren't learning anything. They were only getting closer to the human's answers, but further from the knowledge itself. Threx's desperation reached its peak when the proctor walked by. The alien supervisor's sharp eyes scanned the room, stopping for a moment at Threx's desk. Threx froze, holding their breath. They quickly hid their paper, trying to act natural, but the proctor didn't seem convinced. Threx could feel their heart racing in their chest. The pressure of being caught, of failing, was almost too much to bear. The proctor glanced at the human, then back at Threx, before moving on. Threx let out a shaky breath. That was too close. It was clear that if they kept trying to copy, they were bound to be caught. The realization hit Threx like a wave. They had no choice but to rely on themselves. No more shortcuts, no more cheating. If they wanted to finish this exam, they had to actually solve the problems on their own. Threx's mind raced, trying to push past the panic. The humans' perfect answers weren't going to help them anymore. Threx had to trust in their own abilities. They had to dig deep and focus. The pressure wasn't going to go away. But if they didn't try, they would fail. Threx glanced at their paper once more, their heart pounding. They had to start over. They had to solve these problems from the beginning, by themselves. Taking a deep breath, Threx picked up their pen and started writing again. This time, they didn't look at anyone else. They didn't worry about what the human was doing. It was time to face the challenge head-on. Threx knew it wouldn't be easy, but the desperation was gone. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Learn. Threx's mind buzzed with confusion as the exam continued. They stared at their paper, the equations and questions all starting to blur together. The pressure weighed heavily on their shoulders, but something inside them had shifted. They couldn't cheat anymore. They had tried, but the answers didn't make sense, and copying the human's work had only brought them closer to failure. But now, as Threx looked down at their paper, something clicked. For the first time, Threx realized what had been so different about the human. It wasn't just the memory, the ability to recall information. It was the understanding. The human wasn't just remembering facts. They were seeing the bigger picture, making connections, and solving the problems in ways that Threx hadn't even considered. Threx sat back in their chair and took a deep breath. The panic was still there, but it was starting to fade. They looked around the room, watching as the other students scribbled away. Some looking frustrated, some calm, but all working. The human wasn't the only one who had an incredible memory. Threx had their own strengths. They had always been quick to solve problems, fast at analyzing and breaking things down. But now, for the first time, Threx saw that there was something even more important than speed: understanding. The truth hit Threx like a ton of bricks. They had been so focused on shortcuts, on finding an easy way out, that they had missed the entire point of the exam. It wasn't about memorizing facts or copying answers. It was about solving problems, about thinking critically. And that was what the human had done. They hadn't just memorized answers. They had solved the problems from the ground up, understanding every step along the way. Threx felt a strange mix of admiration and frustration. They had spent so much time trying to catch up to the human, trying to take the easy way out, that they had forgotten the most important lesson of all. There was no shortcut to true knowledge. The human wasn't special because they could memorize everything. They were special because they could think through the problems, break them down, and find the answers. Threx sat up straighter. For the first time, they started to see the problems in a new light. They picked up their pen, looked at the first equation, and began to think. Instead of trying to force the answers into place, they focused on understanding what the question was asking. They broke it down, step by step, and slowly, the solution began to take shape. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Threx looked over at the human again. They were still writing, still working steadily. But now, Threx didn't feel the same envy. Instead, they felt something different: respect. The human wasn't using any tricks. They were simply using their mind, their ability to think critically and apply what they knew. That was the true secret weapon, the thing that Threx had been missing. The more Threx worked, the more they realized how much they had underestimated the human. The human wasn't perfect because they could remember everything. They were perfect because they understood everything. Threx had been so focused on finding an easier way, they had forgotten the value of real learning. Now, as they slowly solved each question, Threx could feel a sense of accomplishment that had never come with cheating. The truth was clear now. It wasn't about the answers. It was about how you got there. Threx had spent so much time trying to find shortcuts that they had missed the journey. The human hadn't just memorized answers. They had learned. They had spent the time to truly understand the material. And that made all the difference. Threx looked at their paper once more, their mind clearer than it had been all exam. They had been so desperate, so focused on catching up to the human, that they had forgotten the most important lesson of all. True knowledge came from effort, from struggle, from understanding. The human had shown Threx the truth. It wasn't about finding an easy way out. It was about putting in the work, thinking critically, and solving problems with understanding. Threx smiled to themselves, a small but genuine smile. They had learned something important today, something that would stay with them long after the exam was over. With newfound confidence, Threx finished the exam, not with perfect answers, but with answers that made sense, answers that came from their own understanding, from their own mind. They knew they hadn't copied the human's work. They hadn't taken the easy way. They had done it their way. And that, in the end, was the true victory. As Threx handed in their paper, they couldn't help but look over at the human one last time. The human was still writing, calm and focused. Threx felt a deep sense of respect for them. The human had taught Threx something far more important than any exam could offer: the value of learning, the power of understanding, and the strength that came from using their own mind. The final minutes of the exam ticked away. Threx's pen hovered above the last question, but their mind was still racing. They had finished the problems, but it wasn't the result that was on their mind now. It was the journey. The exam had started as a race, a competition to see who could finish first. Threx had wanted to win, to prove themselves, but now, after everything that had happened, winning didn't seem as important. Threx looked around the room, watching as the other students put down their pens, some satisfied, others looking a little worried. The human was still writing, as steady and calm as ever. Threx noticed something different about them now. It wasn't just that the human was finishing their exam with ease. It was how they had worked throughout the entire test. Focused, thoughtful, and patient. Threx leaned back in their chair, a strange feeling bubbling inside them. It wasn't envy anymore. It was respect. The human had shown them a whole new way of thinking, a way of learning that didn't rely on shortcuts or tricks. It relied on hard work, patience, and understanding. Threx felt a small but genuine sense of pride that they had learned this lesson, even if it had taken an entire exam for it to sink in. The proctor's voice broke through the silence, announcing that there were only a few minutes left. Threx quickly checked their answers one last time, trying to be sure they hadn't missed anything. They felt a sense of calm that they hadn't had at the beginning of the exam. For the first time, Threx knew they had done their best. No cheating, no shortcuts, just their own effort and understanding. As the proctor called out the final warning, Threx's eyes darted toward the human. They had finished, their paper neatly set down on the desk. The human didn't look around or glance at anyone else. They were just quietly waiting. Threx had no idea what the human's score would be, but they knew one thing for sure. The human had earned it. The exam ended with the proctor's loud signal. Everyone stood up to hand in their papers, but Threx hesitated for a moment. They looked at their own answers one last time, feeling an odd sense of peace. Sure, they might not have scored the highest, but Threx was no longer worried. They had learned something far more valuable today. As Threx handed in their paper and made their way back to their seat, they noticed something strange. The human was standing in front of the proctor, speaking quietly but confidently. Threx couldn't hear the words, but the expression on the proctor's face was one of surprise. The human had caught the proctor's attention somehow. Threx couldn't help but wonder what was going on. A few moments later, the proctor nodded and gestured for the human to take a seat again. Threx watched, confused. Why had the human gotten special attention? It wasn't uncommon for students to speak with the proctor after an exam, but the look of surprise on the proctor's face made Threx wonder if something more had happened. When the results were handed out, Threx's heart skipped a beat. They glanced at the paper, scanning for their own score. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to pass. They felt a wave of relief. Then, Threx looked over at the human's paper, curious about their score. But when they saw it, Threx's jaw dropped. The human had scored a perfect 100%, but it wasn't the score that shocked Threx. It was the note written at the top. Exceptional work, beyond the normal expectations. I've never seen someone grasp these concepts so quickly. You're ready for the next level. Threx stared in disbelief. How had the human done this? It was more than just remembering answers. It was about understanding, about seeing the bigger picture. The human had impressed not only the proctor, but also the entire class. Threx turned to look at the human, who had a small, satisfied smile on their face. The human wasn't gloating or celebrating. They were just calm, as if they had known all along that their hard work would pay off. It was then that Threx realized the true lesson of the exam. It wasn't about the grade. It wasn't about winning or being the fastest. It was about the effort, the dedication, and the understanding that went into solving the problems. The human had shown Threx what true learning looked like, and it was something Threx would never forget. As the class started to pack up and leave, Threx took one last look at the human. They didn't need to be the best or the fastest. They didn't need to cheat or cut corners. The human had earned their score through hard work and understanding. And Threx, for the first time, realized that that was enough. They didn't need to compete with the human anymore. They just needed to learn, to grow, and to do their best. And with that, Threx walked out of the exam room with a new sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the true victory was in the learning itself. The days following the exam felt different for Threx. They walked through the halls of the academy with a new sense of purpose, their mind buzzing with the lessons they had learned. It wasn't just about the exam or the grade anymore. It was about how they had changed, how their way of thinking had shifted. Threx had been so focused on shortcuts and competition, but now they saw things differently. The human had taught them that true success came from understanding, from effort, and from learning the real lessons, not just the answers. But Threx still had questions. The human had been a mystery to them during the whole exam. How could they stay so calm and focused while everyone else seemed to be struggling? How did they manage to understand the material so easily? Threx couldn't help but feel a growing curiosity about them, a curiosity that went beyond just the exam. They wanted to know more, to learn from the human, but they didn't know how to approach them. One afternoon, as Threx was walking down the hall, they spotted the human sitting alone in the courtyard, reading a book. The human seemed so peaceful, so at ease with themselves. Threx hesitated for a moment, unsure if they should approach. But then, something inside them urged them to go forward. They had learned so much from this person already, and maybe, just maybe, they could learn even more. With a deep breath, Threx walked over to the human and sat down across from them. The human looked up from their book, a small smile crossing their face when they saw Threx. "Oh hey," the human said, their voice calm and friendly. "You're Threx, right?" Threx nodded, feeling a little nervous. "Yes. I wanted to talk to you about the exam." The human raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "Sure, what about it?" Threx hesitated for a moment before speaking. You were different during the exam. You didn't seem worried or rushed. How did you do it? How did you understand everything so well?" The human's smile softened, and they closed the book, giving Threx their full attention. "Well, to be honest, I didn't really focus on being perfect. I just tried to understand what the questions were asking. I've always believed that if you truly understand the problem, the solution will come to you." Threx looked at them, confused but intrigued. "But how do you know what to do?" "I kept getting stuck. It felt like the answers were just out of my reach." The human thought for a moment, then spoke again. "It's okay to get stuck. The important thing is not to give up when that happens. Sometimes you just need to take a step back, breathe, and look at the problem from a different angle. It's about being patient with yourself and trusting that you can figure it out." Threx nodded slowly, processing the words. They hadn't thought about it that way before. They had always been in such a hurry to finish, to beat the clock, but now they understood that taking time and thinking carefully was just as important. "I wish I had known that during the exam," Threx admitted. "I was so focused on finishing quickly that I forgot about actually understanding the problems." The human smiled gently. "It's all right. You're learning now, and that's what matters. Everyone has their own pace. The key is to keep going, to keep learning." Threx felt a warmth in their chest at the human's words. There was no judgment, no criticism, just understanding. It was something Threx hadn't expected, but it made them feel better about the whole experience. Maybe they didn't have to be perfect after all. "Thanks," Threx said, their voice soft. "I needed to hear that." The human's smile grew. "Anytime. We all have moments where we get stuck. The important thing is to keep trying and learn from it." There was a brief pause before Threx spoke again. "I've been thinking about something else, too. About how I was always competing with you during the exam. I was trying to be better, faster. But now I realize that wasn't the right way to think. I should have been learning, not just trying to win." The human looked thoughtful. "I get that. It's easy to get caught up in competition, but learning isn't a race. It's a journey. And we all have our own path." Threx smiled, feeling the sense of relief. For the first time, they didn't feel like they were falling behind or failing. They were simply learning, growing, and moving forward. "You're right," Threx said quietly. "I think I've been too focused on trying to be the best. Maybe I need to start focusing on being the best version of myself." The human nodded. "That's a great way to put it. Everyone has their own strengths, and that's what makes us unique." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the courtyard. Threx sat there, feeling something new and unfamiliar, a sense of peace. They had come to the human to learn something about exams, but they had ended up learning something much bigger. The importance of patience, understanding, and friendship. "You know," Threx said, breaking the silence, "I think we could learn a lot from each other. Maybe we could study together sometime." The human's eyes lit up with a smile. "I'd like that. I think we'd make a good team." And just like that, a new friendship began. It wasn't about being the best, or winning, or even passing exams. It was about learning together, growing together, and supporting each other along the way. Threx and the human had come a long way, from rivals to friends, and they both knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would take them far beyond the classroom.